Hi, we continue in Acts 5 today after the second summary that you can see on the right side of the screen in the purple box, where everybody held the apostles in high esteem and numbers are being added, and people are even carrying the weak out in the streets for healing, and even believe that Peter's shadow is enough to heal them. So in the face of that, we'll see that the rivalry or jealousy or envy, depending on how we translated that, of the Sadducees arise, and they arrest them and put them in prison again. As we continue through chapter 5, we're going to see a great contrast between the method by which the Sadducees try to quell this movement, and then after that, with the entire Sanhedrin and the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, all gathered, a Pharisee named Gamaliel will stand up and offer a different approach. And as we'll see there, the Pharisees, who are characterized in Luke's Gospel as lovers of silver, and as I was suggesting then, as stand-ins for the elite of Luke's Roman audience, in Acts, the Sadducees and Pharisees really play more of the historic role that they had in relation to the temple and in relation to dissent and other forms of belief, as well as in relation to Rome. So we'll see some realistic element of that here. But we won't see the Sadducees again until chapter 23, when the narrator will tell us, in the face of Paul finding himself within a group of people, some of whom are Sadducees and some of whom are Pharisees, about the differences between them. And one of those differences is the Sadducees don't believe in angels. And so as we see on the left side, the Sadducees introduced here, an angel will appear in the two verses later in verse 19, something they don't believe is real. So already Luke is telling us, before they even respond, the Sadducees have no clue because the angels are plainly real. We'll see a little different approach to the Pharisees represented by Gamaliel when we get to that. So let's look back at our shape here. We've been looking at the little ABA chiasms throughout this unit, and now we're on this one here, and we'll continue through this one, and if we don't finish the whole one here, we'll look at least a part of it, and then we see how it continues in these ABA chiastic shapes as it continues. And we'll also notice we see right away the new RSV on the left says the high priest took action, but I have it here as the high priest stood up, which is literally the meaning of it there. And as my little footnote, I don't usually put footnotes in these shape and key words charts, but as I was noting here, there are three Greek words used for rise, stand up, or get up. And I don't normally color code different words with the same color, but I wanted to here because what's at stake is Luke's using a variety of language, just like he uses three different words for prison, as my note continues, to highlight certain themes. So he doesn't have to use the same word to highlight it. So here the whole issue is about standing up and who's standing up and who's not. And obviously there's also the issue about being imprisoned. And we'll look at the language of that as we go. So the high priest stood up, and he and all who were with him. So at first we're seeing the Sadducees. The high priest is not inherently a Sadducee. The Sadducees are described here as a sect. We'll look at that word in a minute. But it's certainly likely because the high priest and the Sadducees were the wealthy elite. They were the ones that were most dependent upon Rome for their position, and the least connected to the ordinary people. And as we've seen, they're afraid of the people. And so that raises a real question about why the Sadducees are described as filled with jealousy, because the apostles are popular amongst the ordinary people who the Sadducees don't really care that much about. So that's just setting up our scene. Let's look at the details. So he and all who were with him here, indicating the battle lines are being drawn. And then we get to the interesting word heresis. And if you're a Christian, and you might know the term heresy with its much later meaning as developed through the Council of Nicaea and after as a belief that's contrary to the official doctrine of the church. Hence the Nicene Council and around Constantine, and the Arians who dissented from that are called heretics. But that's not what it means here. Here it means simply a subset of a larger group, whether that's a religion or something else. And you can see from my note below the ways it's used. So here for the Sadducees, in chapter 15 for the Pharisees, in chapter 24 the followers of Jesus are accused of being something called the sect of the Nazarenes. Then in chapter 24 of the Way, again with the Pharisees in 26, and only as Christians in 28. But let's look at that one because that's unusual. They're not actually called Christians there. That was an older note of mine before I recognized that that wasn't really the case. This sect we know that everywhere is spoken against, which doesn't get a name. So the point being, the contrary of my note here, which is just wrong, I make mistakes too, never are they called Christians. And I really want to highlight that although there are accusations of people being called Christians by others in Antioch and elsewhere. They're never called that by the narrator directly or by themselves. This is not about replacing Judaism with a new religion called Christianity. It's about focusing on what I call the religion of creation thread of the Bible and the tradition that Jesus grew up with as a part of the people of Israel, versus what the leaders are expressing here, which is the religion of empire, both of which lines of theology and practice have existed throughout the entire biblical period and continue to exist this day, both within the world we might call Judaism and also within the world we call Christianity. And if all you have to do is look at the news in a given day and see how people respond to questions of anti-Semitism or immigration or other issues to see where people stand within those larger categories. So here, the sect of the Sadducees is within, of course, the larger tradition of what we call Judaism. We saw them back in chapter 4, and we'll see them again in chapter 23. But notice the narrator doesn't tell us now they don't believe in angels, and Luke's Roman audience would have no reason to know that any more than a Jewish audience would know some of the details of the Roman organizational structures and practices. So it'll come as a surprise later, the contrast between the angel here and the Sadducees' belief. But the Sadducees are mentioned here, and they're not really at issue. What will be at issue is the priest and the larger group, as we'll see. So they're described as being filled in the New RSV with jealousy, zelo. That can mean zealous in the sense of passionately for something. It can also mean envy, and that may be more likely the case here. It's hardly the sake that they're jealous in the sense, as I was noting, that they aren't concerned with popularity amongst the ordinary people. They're concerned with their status amongst the elite. They certainly mostly have contempt for the ordinary people as being uneducated and poor, like wealthy people often do throughout the ages and throughout all kinds of places. So now they're collectively described as arresting the apostles and putting them in the public prison, but there's some details we need to look at there. So arrested is literally laid hands upon. And yes, that's a euphemism for arrest, but I want to highlight that because just as we saw in the Ananias and Sapphira scene, the contrast between those who faithfully put the proceeds of their sales at the feet of the apostles versus Ananias and Sapphira having their dead bodies involuntarily at the feet of the apostles, we saw in the previous scene the hands of the apostles being used for healing, not directly but indirectly at least. We can see here they laid them on cots and mats so that Peter's shadow might overshadow them, and so they're out there amongst the people with the Holy Spirit healing people with their hands, or at least relation to their hands, and now these hands are used to arrest people and put them in prison. And it can go either way, as many scholars note. This phrase could be in the public prison or put them publicly in prison. The word for publicly, demosia, here is in a few other places, but not elsewhere in the New Testament. And the word here for prison is teresis, literally a guarding place. So it doesn't have to be a building with walls and a door on it. It could just be a place that people are held. It's one of the several words that we'll see here. As you can see from this image, this is the only sense we have of any kind of prison in Jerusalem. It's now a monastery of the Praetorium, not the same Praetorium that Pilate had as his headquarters. It's understood, at least for tourists, as the place where Jesus was held in prison. Maybe it's the place they were, but whether it's the historic place or not, it's important to recognize it's not like a modern U.S. prison or even a prison in much of the so-called civilized world. This would just be a dark place, often a cave, with no access and no light. So it would not be anything one might call pleasant or even reasonable. It would normally be a holding place until they decided what to do with you, as is the case here. It's not something you'd be sentenced to for a period of years. If people were in prison for a longer term, such as for debt, their family or friends would have to feed them or they wouldn't eat. So that's the circumstances we see here. But during the night, something else happens here. Keener, as well as other scholars, shows parallels from the Greek writer Euripides and notices there the story in the Bacchanalia of Dionysus freed his followers from prison and the fetters fell of themselves, automata, which we will see not here, but we will see in chapter 12 when something like that similarly happens. Similarly, doors unbolted themselves without human hands. He notes that Hellenistic Judaism had already adopted the motif probably by the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, and it may well be that that's in the background, but certainly Luke is not expecting his audience to be thinking of Euripides here. It might have just been something that inspired his use of this image here. So during the night, an angel of the Lord, or simply a messenger, and it's important to hear that it's an angelos, and that doesn't have to be a supernatural creature that we think of as an angel. It can simply be a representative of Jesus or of God. Lord can go either direction here. So it could just be one of their own members came and got them. We see nothing supernatural about this scene. So the fact that I was noting it was an angel in relation to the Sadducees is still the case, but we could hear this simply as a messenger. And yet it happens in a way that the folks who are guarding the prison don't notice. So either they're completely asleep or there's something perhaps supernatural going on, but it's never noted exactly. So let's look at the details here. Open the prison doors here, anoixos here, the first of 16 times in Acts, and here uses a different word for prison, phylakes, which if you didn't happen to see, no reason you would if you can't read the Greek, that was the term on the picture I showed you from the prison in Jerusalem associated with Jesus. And didn't just bring them out, but led them out. Exago, and I really want to highlight that because we'll see it a few times, but they're all these examples are related to Egypt. In chapter 7, this is Stephen's speech where he's talking about Yahweh and Moses leading them out. Of course, they don't use Yahweh in the New Testament, they simply say God. And in 21:38, it's about an Egyptian in the story. So all of these are references to Egypt, often referred to as the house of bondage, not using the word for prison exactly. We see that term house of bondage here in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and also in Micah. And this is the reference to it, the prison in Acts in 12:17 that we'll see the next time. So it's suggesting with no small sense of irony that the Sanhedrin are like Pharaoh. And I would suggest that's exactly right. That it's not about nationality, it's about what their stance is, to the extent that they're practicing what I call the religion of empire, which is to say, to use violence and force and domination to get their will. It doesn't matter what their ethnicity is or where they're living or who they work for. They're practicing the religion of empire in the face of the apostles' nonviolence, which is part of the religion of creation. So here they are being rescued by an angel, just as the Israelites were rescued from the house of bondage in Egypt. And the angel or the messenger says to them, go stand in the temple. Or it's a passive errative, so literally be settled or be stationed. The stand has the active, but it's the passive in the sense of have this happen to you. So settle yourself or station yourself in the temple and tell the people the whole message, all, panta here, and remata for message, which could be a term for simply a speech or a statement. It's not the word that we'll hear later, and we hear it in Paul, for the gospel message as such, some forms of euangelion and others. But here it's the message of this life, about this life, this Zoe. And again, not Christianity and not over against Jesus, or against Jews rather, but a way of life founded in the death and resurrection and teaching of Jesus. So when they heard this, hearing the word and doing it, echoing from Luke's gospel, they entered the temple at daybreak. Horthron here, as Keener notes, public life in the ancient Mediterranean world began at daybreak, and not only in Judea. And that makes sense, especially in the times of the year when things are warm, that you go out whenever there's light, and when it's night, you go back home. So they entered the temple at daybreak and went on with their teaching. And you have to imagine that did the ordinary people out there know they were arrested and put in prison? Or was that done behind the scenes? We don't know. And we don't hear any response from the people. Instead, we simply hear the response from the high priest. So when the high priest and those with him arrived where isn't clear. The word here, periginomai, is 3 times in these next few verses, as you can see in 22-25. There's a lot of arriving going on here. They certainly are not arriving at the prison. They must be understood as arriving somewhere at the temple, but they're plainly not where the apostles are. They wouldn't have to send people to the prison to get them out of the prison. They would see them. So they're somewhere else in the large space. They called together, one of those soon words we looked at last time, sunakalesin here, and we see it a number of times, the council, the Sanhedrin here, but also the Gerousia here. And it's only here in the New Testament, 35 times in the Septuagint, mostly in the Torah as town elders. But we see it several times in the later texts, in 2nd Maccabees here and in 1st Maccabees, translated as Senate, as the representation of the leadership in Judea, where there isn't as yet something called called the Sanhedrin. So we see several representations of it there. It's also sometimes simply the Council of Elders, and we see the elders of Israel also in Exodus a number of times. In Exodus, the elders of Israel are the intermediaries between Yahweh and Moses on the one hand and the ordinary people on the other hand. So there in the Exodus story, the elders are on the liberation side. Here the elders, well, which side are they on? They're being called together by the Sadducees, but we really don't know what their stance is on the Jesus movement at this point. We'll have to wait until they have an active role. So they're all called together, but it seems to be still that it's the high priest and those with him who are sending to the prison, or maybe it's all of them. It's not clear here. And apostle to the prison. And isn't that a little bit fun? Apostolo is a verb. It's 24 times in Acts, so it's not a unique situation. But it's interesting, the apostle to have the apostles brought to them. The word of the verb apostle means to be sent. And here's the third word, the demasterion here, and we see that here and in this immediate scene, and then only one other time. It's only in Matthew, elsewhere in the New Testament, 8 times in the Septuagint. So that's the third word there for that. So let's scroll down to continue our scene here a little bit. Temple police is a wrong translation in the ORC, both in John's Gospel when they're described as the people who arrest Jesus, and here. The word huperitai, Walton suggests attendants, some suggest helpers. I translate it literally as underlings, even though the word huper in Greek literally means over, as Greek scholars of the Greek language, much more proficient than me, highlight. By the 1st century, these things were used in a little bit reverse, much like flammable and inflammable are synonyms, even though they should be opposites. So really the attendants, there's no such thing as police in this world. There's no such thing as police in the sense of an urban force to keep the peace until the 19th century of the Common Era. So when the attendants went there, in other words, whoever they sent to do this, not people with guns or any kind of authority on their own other than as representatives, they did not find them there. And isn't this fun? Some of the great fun that Luke's having here. I was noting in the Ananias and Sapphira story how so many scholars don't find the humor there, and some of the scholars who don't find the humor there will find humor here. So there's humor throughout. They're looking and looking and looking and not finding, and 3 times they're finding, looking and not finding. It doesn't use the word search, but they're just hapless here. Not finding in the prison, so they returned on a Strepho, only one other time in Luke Acts, and reported here, Apengelon here, reversing the informing of 424, if you recall back there. And they report this: we found the prison securely locked, and that's where Walton notes below the threefold repetition adds to the comedy. Securely locked, the word for securely is asphalia, which is part of the Roman slogan that we'd see in 1 Thessalonians just when they say peace and security. That's when destruction is coming down on them. That phrase, peace and security, pax et securitas in Latin, was part of the Roman slogan. Asphalia is the Greek form of that. So security is something the Romans were about. That's why people were willing to submit to an empire, because they supposedly provided security. So we found the prison securely locked, or the doors closed, securely closed. Cleo doesn't necessarily imply locked, but securely does. So closed. And the guards, phylakes here, related to the phylake as a guarding place, standing at the doors, or set at the doors, much like the apostles were set in the temple. But when we opened them, we found nobody inside. And imagine the scene there. They show up, there the guards are standing at the doors where the apostles are supposed to be in the prison, and there's nobody there. What happened? It's amazing they don't just take the guards out and execute them, and we'll see later prison guards in Philippi who was ready to commit suicide when an earthquake opens the prison, and he's assured he'll be responsible for letting the prisoners go. But here nothing happens about these guards who seemingly allowed these prisoners to escape right before their eyes. So when what's described here is the captain of the temple, the strategos here, we saw strategos in 4:1 around the Sadducees, and we'll see it again in chapter 16. It's not elsewhere in the New Testament. But notice that over a third of the uses are in Maccabees. So there's a real Maccabees background here about the people in Jerusalem facing off into a hostile leadership that's invested in empire. There it's the Seleucids. Here it's indirectly the Romans, but it's really their own people. The Romans are not immediately in sight here at all. So when the strategos of the temple and the chief priests heard these words, notice there's no response from the others. whether that's the rest of the Sadducees or the elders or the rest of the Sanhedrin, which would include people like Gamaliel, as we'll see in the next scene, and probably some other Pharisees. So we only hear the response of the strategos and the chief priests. They were, and these are way under-translated scenes here, as most scholars agree, perplexed and wondering. As my note has, perplexed isn't strong enough to describe what must be their reaction after having convened both the Sanhedrin and the Jerusalem, only to find the prisoners gone. Wondering what might be going on, or asking the question, what is this that has happened? And that's how I translated over here. So they're wondering, quote, what is this that has happened? And isn't that a great question? But again, they don't question the guards. Let's go down just a couple more verses to set up Peter's response. Then an anonymous person arrives, so this is the third arrival here, and announced, look, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple teaching the people. So now we recognize they're somewhere else and don't appear to be in the temple, because this anonymous person who came reported something from the temple. So we don't know where this large meeting of these elders traditionally would have been 70, and the Sanhedrin would have been 70 as well. So where this large gathering was, but not in the temple, perhaps in a meeting room that they have, we're not told. So in response, the captain went with the underlings and brought them, but without violence. Bias there. If you didn't know, the Greek word for violence is bias. For they were afraid of being stoned by the people. And there's wonderful ironies at many levels there, of course, that they're exercising all this power, but they're afraid of the very people that they're supposed to be representing. And the question of being stoned by the people is prescient for what will happen to Stephen in just a chapter or two ahead, but down in chapter 7. So we'll just continue for the questioning and set up Peter here. So when they brought them, they had them stand before the council. As my note below has, the apostles end up in the same place they would have been without the angelic release, but not before the elite are mocked by the narrative. And the high priest questioned them here, eperotao here, only one other time in Acts, 17 of 56 times in Luke. Ironically, there's no question being asked here. There's just simply a statement. And as Keener notes, there's no questioning about the jail escape, just as the guards weren't questioned. They're just focusing on what their immediate thing is you violated our orders. So we gave you strict orders here, 11 times in Acts for Per and Gelaman, not to teach in this name, which they won't say. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem, literally Kai Udu, and behold, you have filled Jerusalem. And again, some of the humor and irony. Jerusalem they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and we saw that Satan had filled Ananias' heart, and now you filled Jerusalem with your teaching. In other words, the Holy Spirit is presiding over all of Jerusalem, because the Holy Spirit-inspired teaching is what is filling people. And we see Didakos for teaching. We've seen it. This is our second time. We'll see it 2 more times. And you were determined to bring this man's blood on us. And the verb for determined, boulethei, is the verb form of boule, the plan that all along in Luke Acts, God has, according to Luke Acts, in order to have what happens, which is to say the death and resurrection of Jesus. To bring this man's blood on us. Ironically, the apostles would carry blood guilt for their hearers if they failed to speak, as Keener notes. Further, as Peter boldly points out, the leaders were guilty of Jesus' blood. So we'll see Peter's speech next time, but the Sadducees and all the people around them are just sputtering here, not knowing what to do. Everything is falling apart around them, and they're being shown to have no power at all. We'll see how this uneducated fisherman speaks to the leadership of Jerusalem. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.